Okay, so I think we can get started right now, and I'll go ahead and do some introductions and then leave the space for you to lead the conversation after that. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. This discussion is all about pharmaceutical asset tracking, and today we have with us Mike Hill, Head of Marketing at Chronicled, the pioneer behind the leading blockchain industry network in life sciences and healthcare, the MediLedger Network. And we also have Scott Mooney, who's the Vice President of Distribution Operations at McKesson Corporation, who has supported the assurance of the pharmaceutical supply chain at McKesson through the successful implementation of the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, DSCSA, as well as being responsible for the distribution operation compliance with FDA regulations such as cold chain shipping and storage. Please welcome Mike Hill and Scott Mooney to lead the discussion for today. I'll be here around. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat box and we can get the discussion going.
Great, thank you. My name is Scott Mooney, and I'm going to bring up our presentation deck here, and we'll get that going. I think we're going to get that going. There we are. All right. Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Mike and I are going to walk you through our adventure that we've had together between Chronicle, McKesson, and a number of other industry partners as we work through our pharmaceutical asset tracking. We're talking about the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. We're going to talk about some use cases that have worked and some use cases that we have looked at and then later abandoned as not being practical, using blockchain to be able to help solve some of those particular challenges. First, a couple of brief introductions on who McKesson is, in case you don't know, and Mike is going to do one as to who Chronicle is as well. McKesson is primarily known as a pharmaceutical distribution company here in the United States. We are a global company, however. We do distribute pharmaceuticals in Canada and in the EU. We also distribute some pharmaceuticals in other parts of the world, and we have manufacturing operations around the world as well. In addition to pharmaceutical distribution and some manufacturing, we're also a solution provider for many of our customers, providing to them software and IT products for running the back office of a hospital or a pharmacy, providing dispensing systems, certain analytics softwares, and so on. So we do quite a few different things in quite a few different areas beyond physically moving the product that we sell.
Great, thanks so much, Scott. My name is Mike Hill. As Sridivya said, I'm the head of marketing at Chronicled. We are a technology company based in San Francisco. We are historically a blockchain-focused company. We have some history in interesting spaces like fine art and collectible sneakers. But in 2016, started working with Scott and some other folks in the pharmaceutical industry. And there's a sort of history we'll take you through on how we have become the leading blockchain platform in the healthcare industry. And our vision really is to automate the way healthcare trading partners do business. So how they share data, how they transact. And there's a lot of different use cases. We'll talk about a few today. But our core platform is called MediLedger. This is the MediLedger Network, which was sort of formed through working groups in the pharmaceutical industry, addressing a few different use cases. The way we sort of the way it's sort of positioned, Chronicled builds solutions on top of the MediLedger Network, which is a network run by industry participants. So it's decentralized. Software is run by each of the companies. They transact and do business. We don't see any of the data that runs through the network. That's what really sort of makes this one of a kind. So that's a quick intro.
Okay. So we're going to walk you through and talk a little bit about how collectively in industry MediLedger has been deployed. We're going to give you some background along the way because I think the context of some of the challenges of the issues that we were trying to solve is going to be fairly important to where we found success and where we may have been a little bit challenged as we've gone through this particular adventure. Mike, I think we'll start with you and walk through how the MediLedger network is structured.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that last slide, I just wanted to highlight a really simple, easy tagline that I think helps sort of illustrate, essentially what blockchain can do. Right? It's about alignment, and it's about accuracy. It's about enforcing rules. You've heard the term smart contracts. There's lots of sort of buzzwords out there, but it's essentially, if everybody in an industry, trading partners are always aligned, you can then enforce accuracy on transactions, and everything's always accurate, and the world is a wonderful place. So a little bit of a dive into sort of how MetaLedger is structured on the next slide. Um, the MetaLedger sort of network is run by nodes, just like any blockchain network. And the tricky thing about enterprise blockchain is that there is very sensitive data that needs to be shared with specific trading partners. McKesson has hundreds of suppliers that they ship products for, and there is a lot of sensitive information between each one of those relationships. And so there is both a private messaging layer on each within the network, as well as the blockchain layer. So by private messaging, I mean sensitive information can travel directly between trading partners without actually being on the blockchain, which is exposed to everybody. But the blockchain obviously is used to enforce business rules. And so there's this sort of way that both of those interact to create the value and enforce rules, even on data that's very sensitive, right? That can't be going on the blockchain. We use a technology called zero knowledge proofs. It's basically cryptography that hides the actual information in a sensitive, private message that goes between two trading partners. And so blockchain can enforce rules on that that cryptographic proof rather than the actual sensitive information. So this is sort of, there's two layers. To summarize, public data is shared through the blockchain, and obviously business rules are enforced through the blockchain. And each company runs a node that interacts with both layers. Anything to add to that, Scott?
No, I think this is good from a perspective of understanding. This allows us to be able to share that private information, sometimes almost a little bit closer to a peer-to-peer conversation, but the stuff that is critical for everybody to understand on the blockchain and the rule enforcement is very practical and works quite well for us.
Great.
So we're going to start to dive into how we've applied this in a couple of different areas. And the first couple of use cases we're going to talk about are related to the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. Yes.
Scott, real quick, I was just going to add, for anyone in the audience, I don't know if it was mentioned, but the chat there, feel free to throw in questions there, and we're happy to address them as we go. But just want to make sure that was said. I think a few more folks have joined since we started.
Yeah, well said, Mike. Thank you. So the first two use cases we're going to talk to you about this afternoon are related to what's called the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. And what the Drug Supply Chain Security Act was a 10-year evolution. It's still ongoing. We've still got a couple of steps left to do, but it was a 10-year evolution to create a unique identifier on every single individual saleable prescription drug product in the United States. Previous to this, products had been marked with a lot number. They had been marked with a national drug code. But as we go through the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, we're tracing pharmaceuticals through the supply chain. And in order to do tracing effectively, we need to be able to discretely identify bottle 1 from bottle 2. So in addition to the identifiers that historically have always been there, we're now introducing on drug products a serial number at the discrete saleable unit level. If you buy a case or you have a case of product from a manufacturer, the case has a serial number on it, but also the 144 bottles inside the case are all individually serialized. So we have a very granular amount of data available there that we can see, and it's all about how we're using and how we're exercising that data in our use cases. We began doing rudimentary tracing in 2015, just down to the lot level. 2017 and 2018 required the serial numbers to begin to be affixed to the products by the manufacturers so that they were on every single package. 2019 began verification of saleable returns, and it has since been delayed a little bit by the FDA, but the mechanism will still be coming in. And we're going to talk about that in depth as to how we're able to verify. And what verification means is that anybody in the supply chain should be able to scan a product, identify that product identifier as far as the national drug code, the serial number, the lot, and the expiry, transmit that to the manufacturer, and we're going to talk about how we find the manufacturer, but transmit that and get a affirmative back from the manufacturer. Yes, I truly created a product that matches that identifier, or no, I didn't create a product like that, and you might have a counterfeit or illegitimate product in your hand. That's the 2019 evolution. The 2023 evolution that we're also going to talk about a little bit here is the build where, as every transaction occurs beginning in 2023, those serial numbers need to be referenced as part of the data that's transmitted between the seller and the buyer every time a transaction occurs. So we've got a couple of use cases to talk about on this, and we'll begin by talking about the traceability part, the build for 2023 that we've been working on. Mike, you want to walk us through this slide, and then I'll talk to the next one as to what we actually wound up implementing.
Yeah, absolutely. So this effort in this diagram you see here was based on a proof of concept that was worked through with about 25 different companies in the pharmaceutical industry who sort of put together requirements and tested a proof of concept on the MetaLedger network for that sort of traceability. And I think for a lot of the students, if you're on the call, I get emails a lot about sort of blockchain in the supply chain. And this is what we're talking about when you imagine sort of the perfect world where everybody knows where every drug is. And so in this case, if the drug starts with the manufacturer, the GTIN, that's a sort of product code, is managed by the manufacturer, and that is published on the blockchain. So everybody in the industry sort of has an origin point for where the drug began. And then as it moves through the supply chain, this is an overly simplistic view of one step from the distributor to the dispenser. Oftentimes there's a couple different movements of a drug before it actually gets to the ultimate dispenser. But each of those movements are basically published on the blockchain as an input transaction showing the next step in the progression of the drug down the supply chain. And then through that peer-to-peer network, there's the actual details of where the drug went, how much was in the sort of total lot, all the information that's needed for the typical exchange as drugs move. But the point here is that you can sort of always know who's on the blockchain. Identities are verified before they're accepted on the network. Basically, those product identifiers are validated and they're tracked. So as soon as they get to the end dispenser, you have a system of record all the way back to the manufacturer. And then obviously there's opportunities to use that information to verify financial transactions, which gets pretty interesting. And so that was sort of the vision was, once you have a record of where everything goes at which point, you can also, verify the manufacturer knows exactly how many products from which lot, from how they went through the supply chain all the way to the dispenser, which can be really, really valuable for all sorts of other use cases. So a lot of exciting ideas were formed here. Scott can give you a little bit more sort of the realistic path of where this went.
Yeah, so this from our purely perfectionist idea, I think where we started from, required everybody to be posting everything as it occurs to the blockchain for traceability. And that way, any individual party could go to the blockchain if they wanted to confirm the history of an item, and the blockchain would be able to respond to that. What wound up happening, though, is we got mired down in the industry discussions relative to who can see what and when. How often would we be doing tracing where somebody would be trying to look at all the previous events that may have occurred for an item, and also kind of got a little bit wrapped around a lot of discussion around the minimum number of nodes we needed for security to protect the system and things like that. The pharmaceutical space in the United States is kind of a strange market. It has roughly about 600 manufacturers in it. It has roughly about 120 wholesale distributors. However, 3 of those 120 wholesale distributors account for 93% of all the activity in the United States. And then there's somewhere around 150,000 dispensers at the end of the supply chain. So it's a very, very odd market in the way it's laid out. And that came to be one of the problems we experienced with the blockchain model. As we actually went and implemented, what we wound up doing essentially was keeping that top layer, that peer-to-peer layer, where we're passing transactional data from the manufacturer almost on a point-to-point basis to the distributor. The distributor's ingesting that data and then passing it on to the dispenser. We did not wind up posting the events as they occurred to the blockchain because we got into this struggle a little bit where most all of the transactional activity was limited between two entities, and the simplicity of that peer-to-peer model kind of pulled through, and the blockchain was a struggle for us to get people to agree to host nodes, get people to agree to hosting nodes of the size that could hold all the data that was out there to a certain degree. But more importantly, we often talk in blockchains about the need for trust. And it's a funny conversation, because when you start talking about trust in a room full of your competitors, you quickly find that trust evaporates relatively soon. Our competitors turn out not only to be sometimes other distributors, for example, but they may also be manufacturers. And as people are talking about what they might do with the data and what they might see, we started to run into a lot of objections about, well, wait a minute. I know I sold this to that party over there, but I don't want my supplier to know necessarily I sold it to them. They may choose to go around me and go purchase that, or sell that product directly to the end user. So this particular discussion, we probably spent 18, 19 months working on, somewhere around there. And at the end of the day, this was one that we just kind of said, the use case just was having a difficult time bearing out how we plan to use it. The next model we're going to talk about, though, also related to DSCSA, was an area that we found that trust was a little easier to come by, and our use case was a little easier to justify, everybody agreeing to one way to do it and everybody agreeing to share some data. And this relates to saleable returns. In the context of passing forward transaction information for the DSCSA in the last model we talked about, it was fairly discrete, where there was a seller selling to a specific buyer, and we were just trying to journal, if you will, the transaction between the two parties. But the need for multiple parties to see that activity was fairly limited. When we got to saleable returns, we found that we had an environment where it's quite common where dispensers send product back to the distributor. The distributor is required in the future state, in the 2019 that was then deferred to 2023, they're required to scan that product and then verify with the manufacturer that the information in the barcode that's on that product corresponds to the information that the manufacturer assigned. Sounds relatively simple until we started looking at metrics and quantities of participants in the supply chain. As I mentioned earlier, there are about 650 manufacturers. There are 150 distributors who will be making the verification requests of those 650 manufacturers who have to respond. There are 59 million bottles of product that are returned annually to between pharmacies and their distributors that need to be verified. So this was a high volume, high transaction activity with a lot of different participants. And to complicate matters more, there are between 12 and 18 different solution providers who are providing services in this particular space. So this was an area we looked at seeing, can the blockchain be useful and practical to us here? Can we do something through the MediLedger network that would help address this particular challenge? And this one was a thumbs up. We've got a use case here we did move forward with. And Mike's going to walk you through how that looks.
Great. So yeah, this is really exciting, and I think what probably is what we've claimed, and I think is true, is the first enterprise blockchain use case to be sort of commercially deployed, which is really exciting, obviously, and it is a high volume, but I would argue sort of low value, use case here, but created an opportunity, for organizations to join the network and sort of participate and use blockchain, which has been pretty exciting. So the way this works is pretty straightforward. Manufacturers produce products and manage a sort of product master list. It's called the Epics repository there. That is basically just integrated and shared on the node, the manufacturer's node, and that list is then published on the blockchain. And that means that anybody in the industry who wants to do a verification, and in this case, most of the distributors are the ones doing it. As Scott mentioned, it's a requirement in DSCSA for any returned products, but they can provide issue a verification request saying, here's 4 pieces of data on this product. Can you verify, Mr. Manufacturer, that these are accurate? And that can happen because the blockchain has a record of who owns that product. And so it's about routing the verification requests to the right manufacturer in real time. And so the big benefits here, the differentiation for blockchain really is that one, you have a lot of control over the M&A activity in the space. So as manufacturers are sort of buying and selling product divisions, GTINs can essentially belong to a manufacturer one day and then the next day belong to somebody else. And in most of the industry, there's often a delay in sort of updating the rest of the industry on when that exactly happens. And so you might have a few months of verification requests that are going to the wrong source. So if the manufacturer has control over that list, they own the data, and it's published through blockchain, they can make one update in their system and the entire industry has a real-time view of who owns that product. And so verification requests go directly to the right manufacturer. There's also speed benefits in terms of blockchain. There's a list that everybody has, and so the distributor actually has a copy in real time of who owns every product, and so that verification request can be directed to the right manufacturer in under a second, which is extremely quick. And when you're doing high volume, thousands of these per day, it makes a big difference how fast that verification request comes back. And you're also not there's no party sitting in the middle to route that request. You're doing business directly with your trading partner. The blockchain is automatically providing the routing. So those are some differentiations. Hopefully that explains how it works. Scott, feel free to add anything.
Yeah, so this was one of those scenarios, as I mentioned. You have a lot of different trading partners all trying to have a common understanding as to where the information is sitting at any given point in time, so that the operator at one of the distribution centers can scan that bottle. And while they're still actively working on that bottle, that request is sent out to their solution provider for verification, who has a node access to the blockchain here and is finding out that, oh, this happens to be a Teva item perhaps, and Teva is storing their data over at this particular endpoint, and the message routes there, and we get the response back within half a second, roughly. We have about 75,000 different products in a traditional distribution center that are subject to being able to be verified. So we have a lot of activity and transactional data, and we were thinking this would be a real nightmare without blockchain for everybody to maintain their own individual lookup directories and be able to manage this. This allowed multiple solution providers to come in and each offer their own proprietary offering. But by joining the blockchain, they're sharing a lookup directory. They're using a GS1 standard message for how they're asking the request and how they're getting the response. And it's working very, very well at this particular point in time. We do expect the volume on this network to go up significantly. It's a little bit soft at the moment, but it's not soft because the network's not ready. It's soft because the FDA has moved the goalpost a little bit on this requirement from 2019. They've deferred it until November of 2023, but it's up, it's running, and it's been a great demonstration of the use of the blockchain. Something we haven't really gotten into looking at too closely yet, but it's one of the future use cases that may be considered for a model very similar to this, could potentially be the exchange of master data, so that everybody has a common understanding not only about that particular item and where the data is stored, but it may also be a way to be able to understand exactly the attributes of that particular product well. So today, where each company may have their own master data system, this model could potentially be a master data model for us for the future as well.
Yeah,
so we're going to take you.
Go ahead. No, you're good. No, I was just going to say, when the industry is so interconnected and there's so many players sort of moving in what you would argue is probably one of the more complicated supply chains out there, there's a lot of power, in that sort of shared master data, which is a simple but powerful use case for blockchain.
Yeah. This next one is going to be a little bit more of a complicated scenario. As we were looking around at alternate opportunities that we might have in industry to be able to better collaborate on data, originally we threw somewhere around 24 or 25 different scenarios up on the board at a MediLedger meeting, and started marking them down in priority. This one's first, this one's second, this one's third. One of the ones that we had thrown up there that I think that really stuck right away because everybody reacted to it the same way was contracts and chargebacks. And contracts and chargebacks are a scenario in our business where manufacturers and group purchasing organizations or collectives may negotiate a price The group purchasing organization's value is to be able to aggregate member purchases together and then negotiate special discounts or special pricing based on the volume or the commitment that they're willing to make to the manufacturer's product. This is quite common in the pharmaceutical space. Roughly about 80% of the transactions that we deal with are purchased under a model where the manufacturer has extended a special price offering to the end dispenser or to the end customer. And because the manufacturers don't distribute the product directly, it winds up including the wholesale distributors in the model. So the manufacturer negotiates a price with the GPO, and they agree on a particular price. The GPO extends that price to all of their members, and that GPO could have thousands of members in a particular group purchasing organization. But the wholesale distributor in the middle is expected to facilitate the contract pricing on behalf of the manufacturer. So once the manufacturer and the GPO create that price, the wholesaler purchases the product and puts it on their shelf at wholesale acquisition cost or wholesale average cost, which is the standard flat market rate. And then later, when the wholesaler goes to sell that product to a customer who's serviced by a GPO, you may find out that they paid $100 for the product, but the GPO contract is for $25. In that scenario, the wholesaler bills the customer the $25 plus the markup that the wholesaler is entitled to for the handling of the product, and then has to back bill or charge back the manufacturer for the difference between the original acquisition price, which was the $100, and that negotiated price the manufacturer had extended to the customer through the GPO. We did this historically in the past through EDI, and I have a little graphic at the bottom here showing all the EDI flows that were flowing around for this. You had the manufacturer sending an EDI to the GPO with the contract. You had the GPO sending it back. You had the GPO sending a file to the distributor saying, these are my members that are eligible. You had files going back and forth between the manufacturer and the distributor as to, this is the price that I have on the contract today, and the distributor sending back data saying we acknowledge it. So you had all these EDI feeds going back and forth, but the critical problem that industry was experiencing was that each of these feeds was not synchronized in time. You would have situations where the manufacturer may extend that price to the GPO on a Tuesday. The GPO might inform their customer on a Wednesday, but somehow that EDI file, just as a gross example, didn't get posted until Thursday or Friday at the distributor. So now you're out of sync for a couple of days. You have corrective transactions you have to do. It was just a real mess of timing trying to get all four of the entities shown on this particular chart: the manufacturer, the GPO, the distributor, and the GPO's member who was a dispenser, aligned on the theory that at this given point in time, this was the price of the product. This was the facility that's eligible for that particular product as well. Because not only could the price change over time, but whether somebody was in that group or was not in that group also changes. So it was a very, very dynamic and very troublesome issue. Most distributors in the industry have anywhere from 75 to 100 people working on reconciling these problems manually on a day in, day out basis because they're caused by timing misunderstandings. Most manufacturers have a department of 25 to 40 people, perhaps doing that same kind of a function. Great use for a blockchain case, and here's what we wound up coming up with.
Thanks a lot, Scott. So the real opportunity here, Scott, I think highlighted really well the misalignment that was plaguing the industry before, and alignment is an incredibly powerful feature of blockchain. Everybody has the exact same copy of whatever is published on the blockchain, but I think the value of blockchain and where the opportunity really lies is actually in the ability to execute smart contracts. Again, it's a term that's been thrown around a lot, but taking anything that's published to the blockchain, using that information to then actually execute logic. So this is a great use case, and is a great use case of that, whereas some of the other use cases we mentioned are a little bit more just focused on that alignment. Right. In this case, the manufacturer has a contract they negotiated with the GPO, as Scott mentioned. And so those contracts get updated. New customers are added to the contract. prices are updated, a new contracts are created, and so that communication happens with the wholesaler today, so the wholesaler knows what price to put on the invoice to the customer. And so what we're replacing EDI with is, again, if you think back to that initial diagram, you've got private messaging and blockchain. Contract updates with the price of a product, which customers are eligible, is extremely sensitive. This is not something that a manufacturer wants to share with any other manufacturers or with any wholesalers that are not their trading partner. This is very much, if they have an established relationship with a wholesaler, they're sharing very specific targeted information that wholesaler needs to execute the sale and movement of their products. So the way that we've set this up, and I mentioned this early on, is this concept of cryptography, of zero knowledge proofs. It's, I think, going to be a huge and a hugely important concept in blockchain, and especially enterprise blockchain going forward. So if anybody's interested, I would read more about that. But basically, every time there's an update, a cryptographic proof of that update is published on the blockchain. So nobody has any idea what that update is, but they know that that update met the rules, it's valid, it follows the format and protocol that the network has established. So the wholesaler has a consistent feed of contract updates that all follow the same format. They can then optimize their systems internally to update pricing lists and make sure that the teams that are invoicing customers always have the most up-to-date pricing that's almost directly from the manufacturer's system, which is pretty powerful. But to take it a step further, once you have that invoice, as Scott said, there is a chargeback that's required that basically is the difference between that invoice price and the price the wholesaler paid, the wholesale acquisition cost. So the wholesaler submits a chargeback claim, a chargeback request to the manufacturer to make them whole between that invoice price that they offered from the manufacturer and their cost. And that chargeback is really how manufacturers essentially approve pricing, right? So if there was a delay in the contract update and the wrong price was given to a customer, the wholesaler sends a chargeback and the manufacturer says, this is an error, this price is incorrect.
And they nope, and they say it real loud.
Yeah. So there's estimated somewhere between 2 and 4% of all chargebacks result in an error on the first pass. And there's issues, manufacturers have issues with revenue leakage, with essentially duplicate effort and duplicate communication, because there's now two people, one person in the manufacturer and someone on the wholesaler side, that are going back and forth trying to figure out what the error was, when the update was sent, right? So that coordination creates just huge amounts of wasted resources across the industry. And so this is just such an incredibly powerful use case. So this is live, and we are rolling this out with some of the major wholesalers and manufacturers. You're going to see some press releases coming out in the next month. But yeah, this is basically the chargeback gets verified using the blockchain as proof that the contract data was correct, and the wholesaler knows essentially in real time if the price they offered was correct or not. And in some cases, if there is an issue, they can correct it in real time, and that back and forth communication goes away. Manufacturers always get accurate chargebacks, which impacts government pricing and all sorts of other processes that build off of this. So this is a really powerful use case, and I think is what's really going to drive the adoption with MetaLedger in the industry, and there's all sorts of other use cases to come.
Yeah, no, this is a game changer, because this really, it helps to build trust, because in this model, all the participants have come to the conclusion that by using the blockchain to be able to manage this as opposed to the way we were doing it before, that alignment and that ability to enforce smart contracts in the terms that's how this was functioning puts everybody on a fairly consistent approach and a level playing field. And there is trust now in the system. It is not as adversarial as it was before, when timing issues and delayed payments and differences of interpretation. This means everybody has the same interpretation who's involved in this transaction. All the players believe and understand the same thing at the same particular point in time. So we've kind of gone through this relatively quick. We're going to have some question and answer period coming up here. But as we've shown in these three use cases, one of the largest things that we've come across is that not every single use case that we can look at will lend itself to being suitable for a blockchain. Certain use cases come up that sound very glamorous to say, let's put a blockchain there. And one I haven't talked about here, but I came across this week, was we had internally deployed a blockchain for a use case that we set up a couple of nodes, we replicated the data across it, but after it had been running for a while, we've now looked at it and said that we probably didn't do that right. The way we're managing that data is more as if it was a redundant server. We aren't granting access to multiple parties. We didn't have any issues around trust between the parties. We had no use for smart contracts, but we were forcing a blockchain to try to serve as a redundant server system. And that was a poor use case. So not all use cases lend themselves to them, but many do. And in the ones that we've done here, trust is fairly the universal differentiator. Mike, you want to?
Yeah, and I think that to trust is big, and obviously it's a little harder to sort of use that to gauge, what's an actual use case. So I think there's really two rules of thumb that we've found. The first one is, essentially if there's multiple types of entities, right? So in the chargebacks use case, there's the GPO, the manufacturer, and the wholesaler that all need to be aligned on data. That sort of alignment isn't really feasible with today's technology like EDI or email. And so, yeah, that real-time alignment where everybody's looking at the exact same data is pretty powerful. And that's you see in the product verification use case as well, where everybody can be aligned. The entire industry needs to be aligned essentially on a single manufacturer's list of products that are changing and whatnot is pretty powerful. But the second one, and honestly, you could even argue that the second one is really the most powerful and what's going to really drive adoption, because this is really dollars and cents. Transactions, if you can ensure the accuracy of transactions, and there's all sorts of intercompany transactions that happen in the pharmaceutical industry, errors there cost companies actual money. And so there's real opportunity to build on that. And so the feature here, right, business rule enforcement, smart contracts, different ways of saying it. And that's why it's so powerful. That's why people talk about smart contracts, is that's really the biggest use case that's going to drive adoption, and what sort of fits a criteria for an ideal use case for blockchain. There's a question here, but Scott, do you want to wrap up with anything else?
No, I was going to say, I think as we've gone through this, it has been an adventure for us. This is not my forte. If you haven't picked it up so far in this conversation, I'm not from the IT side of our organization. I'm from the operations side of our organization. So as industry has come together and as the MediLedger group has formed, we've had a neat interaction between technical experts, non-technical people like myself from the operations side. And it's really been a forming, storming, and now we're kind of getting into the norming phase, if you want to think about it in that regard. Some use cases are starting to advance quite well. The contracts and chargebacks one is quite beneficial. The tracing one, not so much. I will admit that the verification for saleable returns, the use for a lookup directory or master data is somewhat rudimentary. But again, it's a use case today where we're using EDI, and we might be able to do that in a better manner as we go forward. We have a question in the chat, though, and if you do have a question, be sure to stick one in there. We'll answer it as best we can. But it asks about whether we can use generic drugs be placed on this same model. And this model, as we've been deploying it, whether it's generic drugs or brand drugs, the mechanism is exactly the same. And generic drugs are suitable or appropriate for contract pricing. So we can use that to reconcile contract price discrepancies, just like we do for brand name drugs in that chargebacks model. It really doesn't matter what the product is as to how it flows through that. It's more about identifying the parties, getting them hooked into the blockchain, getting everybody to have a common understanding of what that pricing looks like and how that may work.
Do we want to invite, it looks like Siri has another question. Siri, if you want to join live, I don't know how we enable that, but
you don't have to. She should be able to. Siri, you can just share your video.
Yeah. Hi. It
Hello.
was all great listening from you all. So I see that given the topic being the pharmaceuticals here, people are mostly used to the existing brands, and buyers actually prefer only particular brands or something like that. So when new entrants come into the model, so what is the data select? How is the business for them? Given that, I don't know, people think really to go for new medicines or something like that, even though the composition is same.
Yeah, I mean, as new medicines come into the market, oftentimes, and we see this a lot with some of the more biomedicines at this particular point, they wind up being smaller manufacturers right out of the gate. They're they're not usually a lot of times coming out from the large manufacturers necessarily. There's some development of new products there, but usually you get a lot of single molecules, single manufacturers in the early stages. They're eligible and able to enter this market and get into the blockchain, but chances are they're coming in with a solution provider as well, because they need to have a variety of different things for their systems. They need to be able to do chargebacks. They need to be able to do pricing files. And those solution providers may be their gateway into the blockchain to be able to access the contracts and chargeback systems or the verification of saleable returns. Because while you may have industry players like McKesson operating their own node on the blockchain, and you'll have perhaps a Johnson & Johnson having a node on the blockchain, or a Pfizer having a node on blockchain, you also have a node for SAP. And you also may have a node for a TraceLink. And these are solution providers that sell digital services to smaller manufacturers or new product market entrants.
It's a little bit like.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your time.
Oh yeah, I was just going to add that I think when a solution provider participates, I think it's pretty easy to understand. They are hosting the software and offering it essentially as a SaaS solution to their customers, right? So it becomes a business opportunity for each solution provider to log in, and sort of each manufacturer that they sell to has their own sort of node within sort of a web-based SaaS model. So the network enables a lot of other business models.
And Mike, that may be one of the things that's somewhat unique in the way this is deployed, is we do have multiple different solution providers operating on this particular blockchain, whereas oftentimes in some of the other models we've looked at, some of the other places I've seen blockchain, you have a proprietary solution provider who's also operating the blockchain. This one is much more open in that there are multiple solution providers hooked into this network.
That's awesome. Can you guys hear me okay? I just noticed that my video's a little, everybody's probably sick of hearing from me. Everybody's probably sick of hearing from me today, but first I want to thank Scott and Mike for being here. And I have a couple of questions and comments. And if somebody else wants to go before me, I'm happy to be quiet. Is there anyone else in the audience? I only see TD, S, JK. Does somebody else want to unmute and ask a question before I go?
I actually had a question regarding this whole supply chain, which involves so many practices, so many processes, so many people in it. In your experience with building it so far, what did you think was the pain point? Which was the toughest thing to include into this whole process?
Change management. When we started talking about this, if this was greenfield, if we were having these discussions about what to put on a blockchain, what not to put on a blockchain, and we didn't already have 25 years worth of history of using EDI, I think a lot of these conversations would have gone very differently. I think we continually as an industry get hung up into how broken does it have to be before you try to make something better? Because even on that contracts and chargebacks model, that we had that slide with all the arrows going everywhere. Yeah, we had a digital solution out there and it was working. Wasn't working optimally, but it did 95% of what it needed to do. Is the 5% pain enough to kind of upend the world and look for a new model? And healthcare, particularly pharmaceutical distribution, has been digital since the early 80s I think we started first scanning product with a linear barcode in like 1982. And we moved away generally as an industry from customers being able to pick up the phone and order products somewhere around 1985. So we had been very digitally engaged for a while, but that meant that we weren't looking to go from 0 to 60. Our delta was to move from 45 to 60. And it's a little harder to have those conversations internally to say, let's revamp this platform over here and do it differently.
All right, thank you. Does any of our other attendees want to unmute and join the conversation?
Just one more, a common question. So when can we expect this model, to enter other countries? Maybe something like India, which is rapidly increasing in the digitalization and all?
So, Mike, I don't know. Do you guys do anything internationally? We do, but I don't know if Chronicled does necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, some of the supply chain stuff is largely driven by regulation, right? So there's a requirement that the government says the industry has to operate a certain way, and so everybody sort of gets a little bit of a kick in the butt and has to sort of figure out the right solution. So that helped motivate and drive some of the early solutions. Contracts and chargebacks, on the other hand, I think is one of the first use cases that's really just driven by pure ROI, right? It's a traditional enterprise sales cycle, right? And companies are after figuring out how to justify and essentially what is that 5% that Scott mentioned? What is that worth to them if they could actually solve that and bring that to a zero? How other countries work, we aren't. Sorry, to simply answer your question, we have not yet started working in other ecosystems outside of the US. Blockchain, there's a social engineering challenge. Is sort of another answer to the question before yours of trying to get the right stakeholders to the table. Obviously, McKesson and some of the other wholesalers that are more international, I think once things start working here, could very easily sort of start establishing relationships and building those connections in other countries. But it's, we can't just go sell to one or two companies, right? It has to be sort of a collective effort of trading partners in a single ecosystem who have to sort of adopt at the same time. So yeah, there's definitely some challenges, but the plan is to expand. It'll take a little while.
Now here comes an ugly truth, though. We come across this one in pharmaceuticals a lot. There are global companies that manufacture pharmaceuticals. You have all the name brands that you're familiar with, the Tevas, the J&Js, the Pfizers, and those guys who market products globally. But there is not a global, what's the right word I'm looking for? Because it's such a heavily regulated industry, product is not interchangeable from one market to the next. The molecule may be made in India, and in India it may be sold in a specific packaging that's required by the government, and the production machinery that produces that molecule has to meet Indian government inspection. But 4 feet away from that, they may be making that same molecule on another production line that's inspected by the US FDA. And while it's chemically the same molecule, it has a different inspection certificate on the packaging line, and it goes into a different package, so that product is not the same identical product, and therefore it's not a global market for the item. You have a US-centric product, you have an India-centric product, you have a Brazilian-centric product. So you have all these global regulators who are really kind of fracturing it. So we're probably a fair ways away from every regulator requiring that the product be treated in a consistent manner for things like traceability. But for things like pricing and chargebacks, I think that's the ROI driven. That's industry driving it, not necessarily the regulator or the country. Is that helpful? It's an odd conversation because you have companies that span the globe, but realistically they operate with 50 different products in 50 different markets, kind of a thing.
Well, Scott and Mike, I really want to thank you for giving of your time. Your last use case really blew my mind on contract pricing, because that's ubiquitous. It's not just unique to the pharmaceutical sector. I mean, at the most common level, you're essentially talking about rebates. And I can't, we've been involved in some ecosystems that tried to crack that nut and they just couldn't because of the governance challenges. So as you start rolling that out, I think the lessons we can learn on how you are able to overcome the big challenges can really help inform a lot more adoption even outside the pharmaceutical industry. So Mike, is Chronicle primarily just focused on pharmaceuticals, or have you thought about generic solutions for contract pricing outside of the pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah, I mean, right now we're very much focused on the pharmaceutical and I would say healthcare industry overall. There's a very similar process in sort of the medical supply, surgical supply space, which is, right next to, sort of pharmaceuticals in terms of, the customers and the process, but it's, a little less regulated, a little less structured, to be honest. So it'll probably be more difficult. Expanding outside of that is not something we're opposed to, but it's just, there's so much to sort of figure out here. It hasn't been sort of top of mind to expand outside of healthcare.
Okay, I have one more question for both of you. So this one's for you, Scott. When the Drug Supply Chain Security Act came out, I mean, everybody was jumping in with solutions. So how did you choose to engage with MediLedger over other kinds of ecosystems, or are you participating more broadly?
I'm a little bit all over the place at the moment. I mean, as far as deep engagements, we're deeper engaged with MediLedger than we are many other places. But I mentioned that I'm not an IT person. So in order for me to figure out what was going on in blockchain, I joined like 7 consortiums all at the same time and spent a little bit of time here and a little bit of time there. The other 6 have generally evaporated at this point in time. MediLedger is the one that's continuing to go forward in the healthcare space. But what wound up happening as soon as one of the distributors joined and a couple of manufacturers and then another distributor joined, well, all of a sudden, 60% of the U.S. purchasing power was sitting at that table inside the MediLedger work group. When we got the third distributor to join, now we were at like 94% of the U.S. purchasing power was sitting there. And I think that was kind of a bit of a game changer in terms of just getting people to recognize that here's a coalition or a group that's working on this, that is practical and realistic, and people are willing to invest. If you don't have that critical mass, you have one over here saying let's do this on my Ethereum network, and one over here says let's do this on something else, and somebody else is over there, and they're very, very fractured discussions. This was more of a global, a comprehensive type discussion because of the critical mass that we wound up achieving.
I love that talking point. And just I have some students in this room here too, and I can see that generalized to some of the other lessons we were learning. Like this morning, Dale Christie, he talks about co-opetition, and he works with DHL and he works with UPS, addressing things like border control issues, right? So when you have this very strange kind of market where a few players can dominate the percentage of transactions, you can kind of move faster if you choose to cooperate with each other. And I think this is a beautiful example. I'd like to say,
be careful. You have to be cautious, because when you have a few large players, you always have to have your mindset on when are you going to run into the anti-competitive rules. What can't you talk about? What can't you do? But if you're talking about standards and ways to do business and things like that are based more on things that are not competitive in nature.
You're not talking about price.
You're
talking about compliance with a new regulation and things like that. Yeah. And so my last question is for Mike. And since I'm an information systems professor, you've got all of these nodes in MediLedger. How often do you have to update the software, and how do you coordinate software updates?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be honest, I think it was brought up at one point where Scott mentioned how many nodes do you need to ensure the security of the network. It honestly came down to how many nodes minimum do we need to make the deployment as simple as possible. At this point, I can't comment on the exact number of nodes at this point, but the number probably won't increase a whole lot beyond this. We are working with solution providers. We may host some nodes ourselves for companies, because the deployment of a blockchain node is a very new concept, especially for companies like McKesson and Pfizer, Genentech. And so it's changing IT policies, security provisions, firewall policies. There's layers and layers of implementation that's needed. McKesson has been with us from day one and can testify to the some of the complexities of deploying a node. And so, yeah, there's not really a need to go beyond, a handful of nodes. I mean, as long as you have sort of a few key stakeholders that are running a node and can verify transactions, we're not working in a market where there's unknown entities, right? This is a private blockchain. Everybody knows everybody on the network. So there's not really a concern that, somebody could sort of do a 50% attack or try to take over the network, because the only people that are allowed on are the 600 manufacturers, the 120 distributors, the 60 or 70 GPOs that are in the US market. So the sort of minimum number of nodes is there, and now we are sort of working on how do we make this as simple as possible for people to deploy. And it's less about the sort of node architecture.
Okay. Can you answer the other question too? How frequently do you have to update the software?
Sorry, yeah. So the updates we're working right now, to be honest, on a more structured release cycle. I mean, this is a traditional software development ecosystem, so we're working on a 3-month, 6-month, 1 year, major, minor release cycle. At the moment, there's patches that are sort of going as we are like in the throes of going live with the contracts and chargeback solution. So, every other week there's, a small one organization has a request for something, another organization has a request for something. And so it's sort of a little bit of a patchwork right now just to get live. And we're moving towards a more structured release cycle that'll follow, probably any traditional software development release cycle. When companies choose to update, obviously, is another concern, and that's another it's a challenge, right? If every company is running their own software, that means we have to be extra cautious that every software is sort of backwards compatible, because we can have 2 companies on the network that are 3 or 4 releases ahead of some other companies, right? And they still need to be able to do business. And so there's work to be done on that sort of the structure and timeline of releases.
Oh, you answered. Thanks, Mike.
That has been one of the interesting parts, because these companies have very, very different work cycles too. So how they connect downtime is something that is very different. Manufacturers tend to work, as far as for their distribution, 8 to 5. Wholesale distributors work overnight. We typically start picking orders in the middle of the night. So we've had issues as we've done updates for various different things, just as simple as the VRS table. Making sure that when it goes down, nobody can work while it's down. That everybody understands when it's going to be down for any maintenance or updates or anything like that. So it's interesting getting collectives to understand that.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, we think about how hard software decisions are within the boundaries of the firm, and doing it at an ecosystem level is a whole nother challenge, but also brings whole new opportunities. So I want to thank you both for closing out the Blockchain for Business conference today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
I'm very grateful to have McKesson as one of our executive advisory board member firms, and Mike Chronicled has been a friend to us for 3 years. We know Suzanne. So we thank you for stepping in today and sharing where you are in your journey. It's really been amazing. You've done a lot in a year.
Yeah, well, hopefully the update next year will be even more exciting.
We'll invite you back, definitely.
Okay.
All right,
thank you for having us.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.